I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I am Mohammed Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another inspiring session of our weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series, Women Poets, which I am co-convening with professors Rivan Sandler and Azita Talagani. At the outset, I like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach and learn on their ancestral homeland. I'd like to welcome Dr. Pegah Shahbaz, our speaker for this afternoon. My colleague, Professor Azita Talagani, will be introducing Dr. Shahbaz and will moderate today's session on Zīb al-Nisā, a hidden poetess at the Mughal court. Professor Talagani.
Thank you, Professor Tavakkoli. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Pegah Shahbaz. Dr. Shahbaz currently is a shared postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, the Asian Institute, an associate member of the Center for Studies and Research on India, South Asia, and its diaspora at the University of Quebec in Montreal. She's also the section editor of the Fables and Tales chapter of Persian projects. She works on questions of narratology, translation, and systems of knowledge transmission in the Persianate world, in particular, the reception and domestication of Indian religious and cultural heritage in Persianate literary culture of Iran, Central and South Asia. Dr. Shahbaz was previously visiting associate professor at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Japan in 2020. Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation for Buddhist Studies Research Fellow at the American Council for Learned Societies, visiting scholar at Leiden University in 2017 and McGill University from 2017 to 2019, visiting scholar also as a grant researcher at the University of British Columbia in 2018-2019. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at Sorbonne University, Paris 3 from 2014 through 2018, where she worked on the Perso-Indica project. She completed her PhD in Persianate studies at the University of Strasbourg with a specialization in Persian prose narratives in India. The title of Dr. Shahbaz's today's lecture is Zīb al-Nisā, a hidden poetess at the Mughal court. Dr. Shahbaz.
Hello, and thank you very much, Professor Tavakkoli, Professor Talagani, and Professor Sandler for your kind invitation. I'm very glad to be here among you this afternoon, and I hope we will have an instructive and fruitful session. So I will begin with my presentation. Beforehand, I apologize for the first slide, which is this one. It's the genealogy of the Mughals in India. Sorry if it is too white and difficult to read. I couldn't find a better picture for that, but we will spend barely 1 minute on it. So anyway, The Mughals, who ruled over much of the Indian subcontinent from present-day Afghanistan in the west to present-day Bangladesh in the east for a period of nearly 3.5 centuries, are one of the great dynasties of world history, admired not only for their imperial ambitions, but for their continuous patronage of art, architecture, and literature. During Mughal rule, there were 15 major emperors. The first 6 rulers, The first 6 rulers from the founder, Babur, to Aurangzeb are traditionally referred to as the Great Mughals. They patronized scholars, writers, calligraphers, and chose Persian as their court and administrative language. Their epic efforts expanded the empire over most of South Asia. And under their patronage, Iranians and Indians worked together in the wide-ranging projects of translation, compilations of some of the best manuals of grammars and dictionaries, scientific treatises, and works of narrative literature. Scholars under the Mughal patronage created the school of poetry and painting, which transformed Persian influences into a distinct Indian style. The 6th Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, was the 3rd son of Shah Jahan, born in 1618, who left the most controversial image of himself in history as an emperor. He was an exceptional military commander who drastically expanded the geographic boundaries of the empire to include the Deccan Plateau in central India to Mughal territory. As an Orthodox Muslim, he reinstated the jizya tax on non-Muslims, destroyed many Hindu temples, revived the power of Muslim clerics, and fostered a political and social divide based on religion. His ruthless behavior towards the close members of his own family suggests the image of a tyrant and oppressor. He imprisoned his father in the Agra fort until his death, outmaneuvered his brothers, and arranged for their death in order to become emperor. During his 50 years of kingship, he sought to practice the orthodox Sharia to render Islamic justice. He didn't drink wine, he restricted the harem, and didn't indulge in debauchery with concubines. François Bernier, a French medical doctor in the employ of Aurangzeb in Shahjahanabad, the Old Delhi, writes in his travelogue that Aurangzeb was more serious than his father Shah Jahan and was anxious to appear a true Muslim. His extremely liberal and erudite brother Dara Shikoh, who had had the Hindu religious texts such as the Upanishad translated into Persian, was beheaded by Aurangzeb in the year 1659. He had called Aurangzeb a Nizami. Bernier also describes the luxurious but cloistered lives of women in the harem. He writes, whereas Shah Jahan invited singing and dancing girls there and often detained them the whole night and amused himself with their antics and follies, French word, Aurangzeb doesn't do so. Like Sunni kings, Aurangzeb was allowed to have 4 legitimate wives, the first of whom was Dilras Bānū Begum, daughter of a noble Iranian man, Shahnawaz Khan, a descendant of Shah Ismail Safavi. Arranged marriages between 2 ruling dynasties, the Safavids and the Gurkhanids, or the Mughals, were common for political reasons to reinforce ties of harmony and peace within the Persian-speaking world. The couple's first child, Zīb al-Nisā, was born in 1639. Her name, meaning the ornament of women, hid a wordplay with the name of his father, Aurangzeb, the ornament of the throne, and was synonymous with her sister's name, Zīb al-Nisā. Aurangzeb adored his firstborn child and invested in her education since her early age of 3. Under the instruction of a hafizeh, a woman who had fully mastered the Quran, named Maryam Begum, Zīb al-Nisā learned the Quran by heart. This pleased Aurangzeb so much that he lavishly celebrated this occasion and awarded her with 30,000 gold coins. Afterwards, Aurangzeb recruited an Iranian learned scholar and poet, Mullah Muhammad Sa'id Ashraf Mazandarani, grandson of Mullah Taqi Majlisi, to educate the princess in different subjects: astrology, maths, philosophy, calligraphy, Persian and Arabic poetry, and rhetoric for 14 years before he returned to Iran. By then, Zīb al-Nisā had full competence in writing different styles of calligraphy, shikasta, naskh, nasta'lir, and had become an accomplished poet. I took some time before changing this slide because the images we have from the travelogues of Europeans, which depict harem or Zenana as a place of strict seclusion in which princesses adorned with diamonds, dressed in clothes embroidered in gold, and showered with exquisite luxury, and they wasted their lives playing and chatting about nonsense. Also, the miniature paintings that illustrate the European fantasies of seduction for Mughal princesses that depict them as representatives of utmost sensuality and beauty and wealth, they are not 100% true. Historical evidence proves the opposite. Princesses didn't seem to live their sexuality. In fact, many never got married. They represented the pillars of purity and chastity for the royal family and needed to be protected. So chastity, purity, and accessibility for Mughal women were crucial. These painted images that illustrate princesses are based on models of appreciation for feminine beauty. The portraits of women are not differentiated. I have other pictures to show you. If you see their faces, they are not differentiated from one another to great extent. And in many cases, women's faces and their posture are very similar. These faces are not highly individualized, and artists who didn't have access to royal women actually were inspired by the women of the commoner women as models. Here you see another series of miniatures in which two princesses, Nur Jahan and Zīb al-Nisā Begum, are illustrated in the same manner, very, very close to one another, very similar to one another. Mughal princesses were invisible to society, but they were very powerful and highly educated women, and they were present there. They were true patrons of art and architecture. Prominent architectural projects in the capital city of Shahjahanabad in the 17th century were commissioned for them. So the most important indicator of their presence in the city in the 17th century was the baghs, the gardens, the mosques, and the palaces that were that bore their names. So indirectly speaking, the reshaped city They reshaped the city through buildings and gardens that bore their own names. It's their own feminine way of being present without being visible, let's say invisible, makhfī. They were makhfī. Oops, that's my hand. At the court, women often played significant roles in politics, which was dominated by men. And although they were behind the curtains of Zenana, they were not, they had great influence over the emperors as mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives. They advised them, attended the negotiations, and mediated conflicts and relationships between the political power and sacred Sufi orders. They did not always affirm the emperor's will, and the relationship with the other pole of power in the society, the religious clerics and Sufis, and the correspondence they had together was worthy of notice. Muzaffar Alam has recently published his new book, The Mughals and the Sufis, and he has a very interesting chapter about Mughal princesses and the relationship they had with the Sufis, masters of their period, and the role they played, the intermediary role they played between the court and the Sufi khanqahs, or the dargahs. For instance, Jahanara was Aurangzeb's sister. She was closer to her brother, Darashkuh, and she also attended meetings held by Chishti and Qadiri Sufis. She questioned Aurangzeb's judgments and urged him to reconsider her decisions. On the other hand, their other sister, Roshan Ara, was closer to Aurangzeb. And so because Aurangzeb was had more tendencies towards the Naqshbandiya, Mujaddidiyya, Sufi order, so Roshan Ara was also closer to the Sufi master of that order, and transmitted the master's message to all. In one of the letters, the Sufi master of the Naqshbandiya, Mujaddidiyya order, writes clearly that she is now assigned with Velayat Kubra amongst all the women of the Zenana, and she has to instruct other women and transmit the Sufi teachings to them. And of course, these Sufi branches were competing with one another, gaining attention and power at the court. So Zīb al-Nisā was brought up surrounded by these powerful women. She would look up to these women and follow their steps. She praised her aunt Jahan Ara and her achievements and said she devoutly aspired to be like her. Aurangzeb did not like panegyrical poetry and had eliminated the position of poet laureate, Malik al-Shu'ara. But Zīb al-Nisā had founded a sort of academy and had a large royal library where she recruited theologians, scholars, and poets. She interacted with Naqshbandiya Sufis, and her letters to the Sufi master, Sheikh Muhammad Naqshband of her time, have been collected in a volume called Zīb al-Munsha'at, which is available today by Mirza Muhammad Khalil in her academy. So she replies to her masters in letters in a very refined and highly literary language, and includes some verses of her own as well. She's said to have had a divan of poetry in which she used the pen name makhfī, hidden, for herself. So the term makhfī puns on several subjects. It can clearly refer to women's chastity and accessibility from public eye out of let's say, piety. But at the same time, it can also refer to Sufi terms. For example, in the Naqshbandiya order, we have two expressions. One is latife akhfa, which one acquires. It's a kind of hidden smoothness, maybe we may say, which one acquires after being trained in the ultimate spiritual state. And it allows the human being to surpass the level of self and to unify the self with godly attributes. And we also have zikr khafi, another term, which refers to the mantras that these Sufis practiced. So zikr khafi means they have to say their mantras, their zikr in heart. They have to say silently. They should not pronounce it. During Aurangzeb's reign, the Naqshbandis had gained a substantial foothold in the court, even though it was still a contested one. Zīb al-Nisā had held sympathies towards this Sufi branch. But this princess appeared far more interested in literary patronage than in the encouragement of the Mujaddidi brand of Islam at the court. Let's talk about this Divan of poetry attributed to her. So a number of manuscripts have survived in libraries in India and Iran, and a few in Europe, under the title of Divan makhfī. And the picture you see is a lithographed version which appeared in Lahore in 1920s, and it is fully accessible, available online. Iranian scholars of Persian literature have also tried to edit this Divan makhfī based on the new manuscripts that they have found. We have one version published in 1983 by Ahmad Karami, and another one published in Iran in 2002 by Mahindokht Siddiqian and Sayyid Abu Talib Mir-Abedini. So in this later version of Divan makhfī, there are over 4,000 couplets attributed to Zīb al-Nisā. And it includes ghazals, over 500 ghazals, and very few qasidas and some other forms of poetry, such as taqib band, muhammas, and some scattered verses from here and there. So the question remains that is she the author of all these poems included in this divan? So some of the information that we find in the Tazkiras are erroneous. So there are a few other poets who wrote poetry and who used makhfī as pen name, both men and women. Among the women, we have the princesses. Again, we have Sayyida Nasab Shah Begum Makhfī, the 16th century Timurid queen in Central Asia. And we have Salima Sultan, Akbar's third wife. We also have Malaki Nur Jahan Begum, Emperor Jahangir's wife. All the three are said to have composed poetry under the pen name of makhfī. And then among men, we have Maulana Sanjar Makhfī, we have Makhfī Rashti or Lahiji, and we have Makhfī Kuknari. So these Tazkiras were written decades after Zīb al-Nisā's life period. So some poems are not by her. Some of the poems that are mentioned in these Tazkiras are not written by her. They belong to other poets. Here you see another Divan al-Makhfī on the right side, published by Naval Kishore Publishers in Lucknow. And down there it's written, it is from the tongue of Rushdie. But on the left side, we have the Divan al-Makhfī, and down there it's written, تصنیف نظیف شاهزاده عالم مخدره نامی ذیب النسا Begum. And we don't see Begum here. And the one on the left was published in Lahore. So these are two different divans by two different poems. Whether she had a full divan or not is another question, but we know that she was a poet. The other reason for that is, for considering her as a poet, is the contemporary traces that we find that attest that she was a poet. Mazandarani, her professor, writes poetry in her praise, and there she praises her at the level of, let's say, Khwaja Nasir and also Khwaja Hafiz of Shiraz. If I can just read, yeah, به حسب شاه کشور دانش به نسب شاهزاده اولیا پرتو دودمان تیموری زینت روزگار ذیب النسا محرم از اهل فضل خواجه نصیر خواجه حافظ ز جمله شعرا. So in accomplishment, ruler of the domain of knowledge, and in lineage, a lofty princess, illuminated ray of the family of Timur, the decoration of time, the ornament of women. So her name is already mentioned here. And then she, later on, he addressed to her saying, you are an intimate of Khwaja Nasir and Khwaja Hafiz, who among all poets were endowed with excellence. After Zīb al-Nisā passes away, Mazandarani's disciple composes a piece of poetry, Champadrai, and then sends it to Mazandarani to have it corrected. And in this piece of poem as well, he clearly mentions Zīb al-Nisā's name and praises her for her skillfulness in composing poetry. Is there anyone who wants to read it, or do I read it? Let's make it interactive.
Please read.
Okay.
How would you do?
رخت هستی بست چون زیب النسا بیگم ز دهر زین غم و زاری جهان چون دیده اعمی شده. این که تأثیر کلامش در مزاج روزگار روح بخش و جان فزاتر از دم عیسی شده. بود از شیرین کلامی خسرو ملک سخن تازه عالم رفت زیب از کشور معنا شده. خویش را اندر تخلص گرچه مخفی می نوشت در هنر لیکن زیاد سهره گیتی شده. سال تاریخ وفاتش را چو پرسیدم ز عقل از ره حسرت بگفت آه از جهان مخفی شده. So when Zīb al-Nisā Begum took her life's trappings from this world, the world turned blind, crying in grief. The impact of her poetry on her time was more soul-stirring and life-giving than Jesus' breath. She ruled the world of poetry because of her sweet verse. When she left, beauty deserted the domain of ideas. She wrote her pen name as makhfī, literally meaning hidden, though her skill gave her great fame in the world. When I asked wisdom for a chronogram of her death, it sighed and said she became hidden from the world. She disappeared from the world. So, I would like to just get back to the previous slides and introduce the English translations that are available of Divan and Zīb al-Nisā. The earliest one is a selection of 50 ghazals rendered from Persian by Mughal and Jesse Duncan Westbrook. It got published in 1913. And then Paul Smith has tried to translate some other ghazals from her. Once in 2013, the book of Zīb al-Nisā, the Princess Sufi Poet Makhfī, and in 2018, a book titled Prince Dara Shukūh and his niece, Princess Zīb al-Nisā. So we have a number of articles in Persian and English about the poetess's life and poetry. Now let's talk a bit about the poetic themes and literary devices found in her poems. Her poetry is mostly ghazal, with major themes of lamentation for love, misfortune, and injustice. We have a large number of plaint, shekvaiye poems. At the same time, self-glorification, tafakhur poetry. She is proud of herself and who she is, her lineage and her skills. And she has a couple of poems in praise of saints, Muslim saints, let's say Muhammad, the Prophet, Ali, which is interesting. She praises Haydar, Ali, and also Hussein, talks about Karbala, which somehow recalls Shiism. And I wonder if because of her mother, who was Iranian, and she came from Safavid dynasty, if she was practicing Shiism or if she was following Sunni branch after her father. The most common poetic devices that you find in her poetry are allusion, talmi. It means she refers to historical, mythical, or religious figures and some particular scenes from their lives. For example, she refers to the story of Layli and Majnun, to the story of Khosrow and Shirin, and she compares herself to the lovers, to Majnun or to Farhad. I can give you one or two examples. For example, she says, چو مجنون رو به وادی کن ز درد عشق ای مخفی که با دلبر در آن وادی عنایت هم عنان بینی. So she's giving herself advice to be like Majnun and abandon everything, just start wandering in the desert, because in this way she will find a way to meet with her beloved. Many, many couplets have the name of Majnun, and she personifies herself with Majnun, the lover, not with the beloved. And her interpretation of love sounds very mystical. One important aspect of her poetry is that she is very much under the influence of Hafez poems. She has practiced composing poems following Hafez ghazals as models. You can find several couplets in which the metrics are the same as the metrics that Hafez has used. Ozan Arusi, Ramal, and Hazaj. Sometimes she uses the exact same compounds and wordplays that Hafez has created and used in her poetry. She uses the same rhyming words, radif and ghafiyeh, or metaphors in her poetry. And I have some examples here to share with you. Hafiz says, دوش رفتم به در میکده خواب آلوده خرق تر دامن و سجاده شراب آلوده. And Zīb al-Nisā says, دایم از گریه بود دیده به آب آلوده ترک مستی نکند لب به شراب آلوده. So we have the same metrics and we have the same rhyming words in the end. And sometimes the themes she expresses are also the same. For example, in this example, we have Zulf al-Sukhan. Sukhan is compared with long tresses, hair, long hair. When Hafiz says, کس چو حافظ نگشاد از رخ اندیش نقاب تا سر زلف سخن را به قلم شانه زدند. Zīb al-Nisā imitates her saying, دماغ جان به سخن تازه می کند مخفی میان زلف سخن نافه ختن دارد. So in both couplets, the major theme is tafakhur, let's say showing superiority in composing poetry. I apologize for those who are among us, and I do not have the English translation. Translating Hafiz's poetry is a great task, and I'm not a certified translator for that. But the major theme here in both couplets are let's say self-glorification, praising self for the great skill in poetry. In another case, she uses lebas al-faqr, the attire of asceticism, let's say, piety, or because faqr here has puns on two meanings. One is being poor, opposite of wealthy, but the other meaning refers to ascetic life, asceticism. So when Hafiz says, من که دارم در گدایی گنج سلطانی به دست کی طمع در گردش گردون دون پرور کنم. And once he says, روزگاری شد که در میخانه خدمت می کنم در لباس فقر کار اهل دولت می کنم. So putting the kingship in opposition with faqr, faqir, or the fakir in English, the yogi who abandons worldly life, and putting two opposite elements, using them together in one couplet, is very typical of Hafiz's poetry, and Zīb al-Nisā also imitates this, saying, در لباس فقر دارم تاج سلطانی به سر تا به چشم آرزوی خویش نشتر میزنم. And the other example is about the metaphor of Nargis Jadoo, the eye being compared to daffodil, having the white color around the yellow pupil in the center. And it has magic values, it has magic impacts. As Hafiz says, آه از آن نرگس جادو که چه بازی انگیخت آه از آن مست که با مردم هوشیار چه کرد. Zīb al-Nisā replies, هم جان بدان دو نرگس جادو سپرده ای هم دل بدان دو سنبل هندو نهاده ای. So since we just saw Hindu in the previous couplet, I would like to also talk a little bit about the representation of India in Zīb al-Nisā's poetry. Zīb al-Nisā does not see India as her homeland. And in several couplets, she expresses her longing for her own homeland, which is Khorasan or Iran. For her, India is the land of obscurity, ظلمات هند, or a garden in which makhfī cannot blossom. And despite the fact that she is very much learned, she is left alone in India, not surrounded by those who know the value of her knowledge and her worth. I will read 2 or 3 of these examples. One of them is آفرین بر جگرم باد که در کشور هند سکه نقد سخن رایج ایران زدم. So she somehow sees herself more, let's say, Iranian than Indian. By Iran, we do not mean Iran as it is today. We mean Persia as it was in the 17th century, and it included also a great part of Central Asia, the Great Khorasan. Or as she says, باز امروز دلم سوی خراسان رفته است. رشته کفر بریده است و به ایمان رفته است. So India was a land for kufr, for those who do not believe in Islam, the Hindus. And so India remains the place for kufr, while Khorasan is introduced as the land of iman, faith to Islam. Or she says, دیدم ظلم و ستم چندان که از ظلمات هند می روم که از بحر خود جای دگر پیدا کنم. And sometimes she refers to Kabul, as she says, وانه شد چون قنچه دل، چون قنچه دل در بهارستان هند رفت مرغ روح مخفی گوشه کابل گرفت. I have, this is actually intriguing to see that a Mughal princess does not see herself in her homeland, and she does not consider India as her homeland. Is it because her mother was Iranian, and is it because she spoke Persian? She wrote in Persian, and Persia was a land for Persians. India was still, did they feel still foreign in India? This is an intriguing question that needs discussion. I'll be happy to hear your opinion about it, because the utopia that historians present of Mughals after Akbar, and the way the tolerance he showed, and created an environment in which both Hindus and Muslims could collaborate together and live peacefully. I wonder to what extent this continued in the Aurangzeb's period. So I also tried to find some elements of femininity in her poetry. She refers to henna, or putting them on the feet or hands. She refers to haya, having a sort of, let's say, shame, trying to be, let's say, a bit timid and not loud in public. Or, for example, once she uses terms that recall women's beauty cosmetics. For example, the surma, the kohl that they used to put on their eyes. I will read some of these verses. One of them is رنگ من در من نهان چون رنگ سرخ اندر حناست. So it refers to the red color of henna that women use to dye their hair and also draw motifs on their hands and feet. و به درد عشق تو شد دیده حیا گستاخ. با شرم که این گفت و حیا را که خبر کرد. بوالهوسان ز عاشقی بسته حنا بسی به دست. So the lovers are wearing henna around their, all over their hands. کشید همت من سرمه حیا در چشم. So she's comparing haya, let's say, this quality of being timid in public and not showing off. She's comparing it to surme, the eyeshadow that she puts over her eyes. And it also, the verse talks about a physical reaction that women were supposed to have, looking downwards, having their eyes down, and not looking into the eyes of men in public. And به حنای کف پای تو قسم, which again refers to henna as an ornament for the body. Aurangzeb held Zīb al-Nisā in high esteem. She appeared to act for many practical purposes as a primary advisor to the emperor. However, she did not agree to initiate into her father's favorite Sufi order, Mujaddidi, in the last years of her life. She showed her objection to some of Aurangzeb's political decisions, such as his expedition against the Rajputs, or once her brother Muhammad Akbar rebelled against Aurangzeb, she seemed to support her brother. As a result, she lost Aurangzeb's confidence. The emperor not only stopped her stipend, but also had her imprisoned in Salimgarh fort in Delhi, where she died in 1702. According to one report, when Aurangzeb heard of her death, he broke down weeping and ordered a tomb to be built over her grave. She was imprisoned and died a prisoner, even though she was her father's favorite daughter. Aurangzeb's grief at her death and the evidence of remorse is best described by the poetess in her own verse. I will read this verse and then stop. گرچه من لیلی اساسم دل چو مجنون در هواست سر به صحرا میزنم لیکن حیا زنجیر پاست بلبل از شاگردیم شد همنشین گل به باغ در محبت کاملم پروانه هم شاگرد ماست بس که بار غم برون انداختم بر آسمان جام نیلی کرد اینک بین که پشت او دوتاست دختر شاهم ولیکن رو به فقر آوردم زیب و زینت بس همینم نام من زیب النساست. Thank you.